Okay, let's move on to the second theme, which is streamlining your approach in general. Basically, this is going to involve cutting unnecessary wordiness, which makes the text easier to read. And you can either just leave it shorter, or you can use that new space to put in more high-value content like statistics or specific examples or transitions or something else. And it also allows the readers to focus on your main ideas. So you cut out the clutter and you remove the distractions. People can just focus on what's really important. I like to think of words like employees. So if you're the owner of a small company, let's say you had 40 employees, but 15 of the employees were just sitting around on Facebook, playing games, doing nothing, talking to each other. They weren't contributing to the company's overall mission, so you would fire those people, and you'd have a more efficient operation. Same thing with your sentences. If you have a 40-word sentence and 15 words are just taking up space and they're not really contributing to the main idea of the sentence, they're not necessary, you just remove them or reword, and you'll make the task much easier for your reader. Okay, let's look at some examples, and they're going to focus on some of the issues that I noticed in your Fall 1 assignment, which were too many parenthetical phrases, overuse of indirect sentence structures, too many prepositions, and long phrases. Let's look at the first one. So what I mean by parenthetical elements, it's just a fancy way of saying supplementary information. So usually this kind of information is enclosed within commas. So, for example, this whose lower values or often blah, 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 this whole piece that's enclosed by the two commas, that's an example of supplementary information. This information is usually relevant enough that you decided to include it, and it's okay to use these parenthetical elements, these like extra blurbs, but just make sure that they're highly relevant and necessary. You also want to be careful not to use too many. So I think people who have this writing style who tend to use these, not always but often, they tend to do it a lot. So I would say no more than one of these extra phrases per sentence is a good guide. And also you probably don't want to have a sentence like this, more than once in a paragraph. Because if you keep doing the same approach where you have a long complex sentence, it can start to weary the reader. So here, when you run into this situation, let's say you're editing your document and you notice that you have a sentence that has more than one of these supplementary phrases, you want to stop and see if they're really necessary. So one solution might be to cut some information that's not so necessary. It's just distracting the reader. Another solution might be to put information in a footnote. You don't want to do that too often, but if it's important enough for the reader to know, but not so important that you want to distract them from the focus of the sentence, sometimes you can do that once in a while. Another solution might be to try to split the sentences into 2 or 3 sentences and use some transition. That's if the value is very high of what you're saying and you want to keep it all, but you also want to make it easier to read. Or another solution could be to just try to reword, maybe keep the ideas in one sentence, but reword it more concisely. So you have to pick what you want to do. As a practical exercise, I'd like you to put the video on pause. And okay, you don't have to write it out or type it out, but take a look and see if you can come up with an idea in your head of, what information is really important here. What would you keep, and what kind of approach would you take to shorten this? All right, so I'm going to give one suggested solution that I grabbed from the website that had this example. Of course, there are many ways that you could do this. And the person decided to cut some of the examples here, like the function of how far from work and the reflection of the difficulty of earning. These are areas that the author decided to cut, and then the rest was rewritten a little bit more straightforwardly. So one strategy that you can use sometimes, if you have a long parenthetical phrase, like this one here, for example, more remote, less densely populated suburbs, blah, 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 you can just use adjectives for that. So they said rural and exurban property values. Rural is nice and simple. Everybody understands it. Exurban is a technical term, but it'll be understood by the readership, just like you guys have finance terms, and that will be understood by the readership. And some of the information was cut, and then some of it was rewritten more straightforwardly. So again, there could be a lot of solutions for how you do this, but what I want you to remember is the concrete guideline when you're going through your document. If you have more than one of these in a sentence, that's where you should stop and check it out. Also, if you have more than one such sentence in a paragraph, you want to stop and see if you really need to keep using that strategy. You should vary your sentence structure. Like sometimes you can use this. Sometimes you use a very short, direct sentence, sometimes a longer sentence. Sometimes you have a parenthetical element, sometimes you don't. That's good because otherwise the reader gets really bored. And so you don't want to sound like a robot where you have the same exact structure, the same exact amount of words every sentence. That would be too much and anyway, not possible to achieve. But just make sure that you're not making the reader work too hard. This is the overall point. Part of your job as a writer is to make it easy to read. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. Favor direct sentence structures. There's some overlap here, just like there was some overlap in the verb suggestions. So in the previous example, we saw a switch to a more direct sentence structure. This example happens to have passive voice. You can use passive voice sometimes. For example, if you want to emphasize the action being done, or if you don't know who did the action, that's okay. But we don't want to use it too much. We don't want to take a roundabout way of getting to the main point if we can just state it directly and simply. In most cases. So I would say your default sentence structure, like what you should kind of start with in most cases, is just the very basic subject, verb, object. Or in other words, we can say who did what, or who said what, or who thought what. And if you do that most of the time, it's going to be very easy to read your text. And then you can mix in some different sentence structures as needed for variety and for emphasis and effect. Okay, let's take a look here. Efficiency measures that have been implemented by the company, blah, blah, blah. So we have a roundabout way of saying what the company did. We can switch this around and just say what the company did X. So one solution given by the source where I grabbed this, which was the HBR Guide to Better Business Writing, which is a good source, by the way, if you're looking for some more examples on conciseness and precision. Our senior management team has cut costs, blah, blah, blah. That's who did what. Our senior management team is the who, and then we have what they did. Very simple, very direct, and we have probably not even a third of the amount of text, so these two sentences have been greatly streamlined. And part of the solution there was switching to that direct sentence structure. Let's look at some other ideas for solving this issue of unnecessary wordiness. You almost never want to use there is, there are, there have been, there will be, or any other variation of that. These are called expletive structures, the same word that we use to talk about bad language. Expletive is also a grammatical term, and it refers to these kinds of indirect sentences. So this is a little bit of overlap. Again, another indirect way of writing. There is a policy that will be approved. Instead, we can usually just remove the there is or there are, say, policy will be approved. Or we could even make it more concise, maybe something like, a new policy will rectify. That loses a little bit of the idea, so maybe we want to keep it. But the point is we don't need this there is. There's another potential problem with there is, there are, and that's that sometimes it can obscure the subject or can hide who's doing the action. So it can be kind of a lazy approach to writing, and this is very, very common. Almost everybody does it at some point or another. So either we have unnecessary wordiness or we're not being clear enough, and either one is an issue. I'll go into the clarity, precision issue in the next video, but this is just an example of how it can be more concise. Basically, there's very little reason to ever use these, and there's 2 or 3 good reasons not to use them, so just don't use this structure ever. Okay, so a policy will soon be approved to rectify the situation. That's just one possible solution. All right, let's move on. This is a big one. Use fewer prepositions. If you can only remember 2 things from this entire video, like I said, remember the verb thing first, use 1-word verbs. But also I would say remember to use, I would say no more than 2 prepositions in a sentence when possible. Again, this is a rough guideline. But I like having a concrete number so that I can stop and check things. So if you don't have some reason to stop and check, you might miss some issues. The Chicago Manual of Style recommends about 1 preposition for every 10 to 15 words of text. Again, a rough guideline. I found that's not only hard to calculate, it's also hard to achieve. So I just like saying in your sentence, try not to use more than 2 prepositions. If you do have more than 2 prepositions, just stop and see, do you really need them? Because usually what happens if you're using a lot of prepositions, you're also using a lot of nouns. And as we mentioned in strategy 3, a lot of times we want to favor the verbs over the nouns because they're stronger, more powerful, and tend to be more concise anyway. So let's take a look at an example here. We have 2 sentences, and in the first sentence we have 3 prepositions, and in the second sentence we have several. The problem with including all these prepositions is at least twofold. One is that it tends to create a clunkier feel to the reading. It's a little more awkward, more stop and go. That can be annoying to the reader. Second is that the prepositions often are combined with nouns. So you have a lot of prepositions and nouns when, as we saw previously, we can try to favor our verbs instead. It tends to be more direct, readable, powerful writing anyway. So take a look and see. And I really suggest that you do this. Put the video on pause. See if you can condense the first sentence and then see if you can condense the second sentence. specifically look at the areas where the prepositions are and see if you can reword those parts to use more verbs and fewer nouns. Okay, so one of the first things you'll notice is that there are a lot of empty phrases in here. We'll talk about that in a moment. You can get rid of a lot of this stuff just almost right out. Now this will require rewording the sentence because it'll change the structure. What the source actually suggested here was even to combine the two sentences and just focus on the main idea. So to increase sales, Promodrotics needs to improve its image. This is concise, it's direct, it's to the point. The solution actually removes all of the prepositions. So we're down to 9 words, and we also remove 9 prepositions. Much easier to read. You'll be surprised how often the prepositions lead to unnecessary wordiness, and you can use more verbs instead. Okay, let's take a look at the final strategy, which is to avoid empty, wordy phrases. We saw how in the previous sentences, actually, that was a problem. An example of this would be due to the fact that. A one-word option for this would just be because. And there's lists and lists of these 2, 3, 4, 5-word phrases. They often involve a preposition as well, where you can just say the same thing with fewer words. In close proximity to, we can just say near. In the event that, we can just say if, in most cases. And again, there's lists and lists of these. I'll upload a resource or two along with the video so you can check a few more out. But again, we're trying to make the most out of our space so that our readers have an easier time understanding our main ideas. Okay, so that's it for these strategies. Remember, if you can't remember anything else, remember use one-word verbs and try to avoid those sentences with too many prepositions. Okay, we'll see you around for the next video, and thanks for your time and attention in this one.